We often view the history of the Church as an organic evolution. The assumption is that modern traditions, like Sunday worship or Easter, are the direct descendants of the community described in the New Testament. Many look back to the 16th century Reformation as the moment the faith was fixed. But while reformers like Luther addressed issues of salvation and grace, they left the Roman calendar and its traditional holidays untouched. They addressed the surface level of the house without ever examining the Roman ground it was built on. Before the 4th century, the landscape looked different. Historical records describe a community where Jews and Gentiles lived side by side, sharing a common lifestyle. They observed the seventh-day Sabbath, kept the biblical feasts, and adhered to original dietary instructions. This unified practice was eventually dismantled. Between 300 and 400 AD, the Roman state began a systematic process of legally separating the church from these early behaviors to consolidate political power. By focusing only on the 16th century Reformation, we overlook a much older shift. We inherit a version of the faith that was legally redesigned 1700 years ago, leaving the original practices behind. For Emperor Constantine, the Roman Empire was facing a crisis of stability. When he moved to merge the state with the church, his primary goal was to establish a universal jurisdiction that could bind a fractured population together. The main obstacle to this unity was the Nazarene influence. These believers prioritized obedience to a specific set of laws that sat outside Roman control. To manage the population, the state needed to eliminate this independent legal framework. Early councils began to treat the divine law as a series of debatable suggestions rather than absolute boundaries. They introduced a legal strategy that shifted the focus from mandatory obedience to flexible interpretation. The result was a merger that prioritized social control. The Roman state provided the church with political protection, and in exchange, the church provided a religion that was easier for the masses to adopt without changing their lifestyle. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century produced the legal documents that finalized this separation. These were not suggestions, they were binding laws designed to criminalize the original way of life. We see the concrete result in Canon 29. This decree officially outlawed resting on the seventh-day Sabbath, mandating Christians move their day of rest to Sunday. The council weaponized the term Judaizer. Anyone caught resting on the Sabbath was labeled anathema, officially cursed and cast out. Canons 37 and 38 went further, making it a crime to receive unleavened bread or celebrate the biblical feasts with Jewish believers. The law was specifically written to stop people from eating together and observing the same calendar. These documents proved the shift from the original practice wasn't a gradual change in heart. It was a separation enforced by the threat of severe legal and social penalties. The sovereign power on this coin of Constantine backed a decree in 333 AD, using food as a test of loyalty to the empire. Records from Patriarch Eutychius describe a brutal practice at church doors on Easter Sunday. As people left the service, they were handed a piece of cooked pork. To refuse the meat was to signal that your loyalty still lay with the law and not with Rome. Those who refused were killed. Patriarch Paul of Constantinople justified this violence by claiming the Torah had been repealed. This provided the theological reasoning to enforce a new Roman diet through the threat of execution. Forcing the consumption of pork created a permanent cultural barrier. It ensured that Jewish and Gentile believers could no longer share a table, effectively ending the unity of the early church through state-mandated diet. When you criminalize a person's physical actions, what they eat, how they rest, and when they celebrate, you change how they view faith. The church moved from a system of physical obedience to one of intellectual agreement. If you believe the right creed, your actions are no longer considered a test of your faith. This raises a question for modern believers. If these 4th century legal decrees are documented history, why are they rarely mentioned in seminaries or from the pulpit? The silence is often financial. For a pastor to admit this history is to admit that their holidays and their day of worship are the products of Roman statecraft. Acknowledging this would jeopardize their credentials and the survival of their institution. This creates a cycle of blindness. We inherit traditions because they have been practiced for generations, assuming they are biblical simply because they are familiar. Understanding this history gives us the tools to look past the Roman shift. It allows us to compare our current traditions against the original record and decide which path we actually want to follow.